Peace be upon you all. I'm Munir Biruk, and welcome to another session in our course Introduction into Cultural Studies. The subject of this presentation is Louis Althusser's conception of ideology, and for that purpose we'll be focusing on his landmark essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. But before we delve into the essay, let me first say a few things to set the scene for our discussion. Louis Althusser was a French structuralist Marxist philosopher. He was born in 1918 in Algeria. He taught for many years in the prestigious École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Like Antonio Gramsci, he was an active member in the French Communist Party. And towards the end of his life, he suffered from fits of mental illness, which was probably the cause behind killing his wife, a crime for which he was not convicted, but was instead consigned into psychiatric hospital for 3 years. Althusser died in 1990. Like many other Western Marxist intellectuals, Althusser had to grapple with certain theoretical problems which Marx and Engels left unresolved in their theorization of Marxism. One such problematic issue, and it's a major one, was the absence of a clear and convincing theory of ideology in classical Marxism. The ambiguity of the concept of ideology in the works of Marx and Engels was ascribed by these Western Marxists to the controversial idea of economic determinism. Economic determinism is the idea which Marx put forward first in his book German Ideology and later on developed in his other works. The idea that the social and economic system determine and shape in a mechanical way the superstructure, that is, people's religious beliefs, ideas, values, artistic and intellectual productions. Louis Althusser was dissatisfied with this idea and rejected it. That is, he rejected economic determinism. His goal or aim was to present and to construct a more convincing theory of ideology which maintains some independence, relative independence and autonomy from the economic and social system. So it's very important to keep in mind these two ideas. I repeat, first, the idea that Louis Althusser rejected economic determinism, and second, that he was interested in advancing, in constructing a theory of ideology which maintains some independence and and autonomy from the base, that is, from the economic system. So it's very important to think of the whole essay of Louis Althusser's essay article Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses as a reformulation, as a thinking, as a revision of the classical Marxist conception of ideology. Louis Althusser wrote his seminal essay Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses in 1970. The essay is extracted from a book which was published posthumously, that is, after the death of Louis Althusser, and was fairly recently translated into English under the title On the Reproduction of Capitalism. So what I intend to do in this presentation is go through three major arguments in the essay. Of course, there are more arguments, but for the sake of simplicity and brevity, I skip many details and I limit myself to these three ideas, which in my view constitute the backbone of the essay. So let's jump into the first of these arguments. Althusser opens his essay with the idea of reproduction. The idea that for the capitalistic system, like any other system, to maintain its existence and its continuity, it has to reproduce itself, it has to regenerate itself. In other words, the circulation of the dominant mode of production is necessary and essential for the preservation of the system. So, to maintain its existence and continuity, the capitalistic system has to reproduce two elements of the mode of production, of its mode of production. The forces of production, which is composed of the means of production and labor power, and the relations of production. So let's talk about each one of these. The means of production simply means machines, the tools and technologies which are necessary for producing commodities. To keep producing these commodities, machines and technologies have to be regenerated and updated, of course through scientific research and inventions, etc. But machines are not adequate. Labor power should also be available. That is, workers, enough workers and laborers. And what encourages, says Althusser, what encourages those workers to be present next morning at the factory gate is the wages which they receive, the money which they receive at the end of each month. These wages are, of course, low, but still help secure the basics of life, shelter, of food, and accommodation for these workers. But labor power also needs, mainly because of the modern division of labor, also needs expertise and skills and know-how to make their work more productive and efficient. The second target of reproduction in the capitalistic system are the relations of production. By the relations of production, it is meant those unequal and hierarchical social relations in the capitalistic system. The gap between the social classes have to be maintained, if not widened even more. The dominant rule should always remain dominant and should always monopolize the means of production, and the ruled class should always be kept in place, that is in inferior and subordinate position. The question now is, how does the process of reproduction take place? Althusser's answer is through state power. The state is the major agent in the operation of reproduction. And state power is in turn established through state apparatuses. State apparatuses mean a bundle or a group of state institutions. Althusser makes distinction between two categories of state apparatuses: repressive state apparatuses, or RSAs, I forgot an S there, I'm sorry, and ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs. If you recall this spatial metaphor from Karl Marx, which he divides into two levels: the base, which is composed of the forces of production and the relations of production, generally speaking, the social and economic system, and the superstructure. Now, Louis Althusser kind of zooms in on the superstructure, which he divides further into repressive state apparatuses and ideological state apparatuses. So let's talk about each one of these. The repressive state apparatuses function mainly through repression and coercive force. And they include institutions such as the courts, police, prisons, administration, the army, and other security and administrative state institutions. These are, of course, indispensable institutions in any system, which keep people in order when necessary, through violence, through punishment, imprisonment, penalties, and, if necessary, through physical violence. Violence, of course, could be real or potential, and could be physical, as it could be physical or symbolic. Ideological state apparatuses, in contrast, are more subtle and less visible because they work behind the shields. Ideological state apparatuses function and operate mainly through soft power, through ideology. And they include the institution of family, religious institutions, the media, the educational institutions, political institutions like political parties and trade unions, and cultural institutions such as museums, galleries, and theaters. These institutions are responsible for inculcating the dominant worldview and for indoctrinating people into definite or into imagining their positions and roles in society. Ideological state apparatuses do not function exclusively through ideology. They need force also, they need violence from time to time. So ideological state apparatuses function primarily and massively through ideology, but secondarily through violence and force. And the repressive state apparatuses function primarily and massively through violence and secondarily through ideology. So the system has to combine both of these modalities in order to reproduce itself. For no system is capable of maintaining its dominance for a long time through force only. To manufacture consent, the system has to polish up its image and has to inculcate its dominant worldview through these institutions. For example, just imagine the family and the schools. Both of them combine those two modalities, ideology and force. They discipline the children, they inculcate in their minds certain ideas, values, and beliefs, but from time to time they punish them and they reprimand them. If not, the children are even sometimes beaten in these institutions. Now let's move on to the third argument in the essay, the characteristics of ideology. Louis Althusser's discussion of the definitions and characteristics of ideology are dispersed in his essay, but I choose to group them here under this subheading to make it easier for you to retain them. The first of these characteristics is the representational nature of ideology. Ideology does not reflect reality. Instead, it functions as a mask, as a painkiller, through which people misrecognize and misapprehend their real conditions of existence. In one of the often quoted statements in the essay, Louis Althusser defines ideology as the representation of the imaginary relation of the individuals to their real conditions of existence. Let me repeat it once again. Althusser defines ideology as the representation of the imaginary relation of the individuals to their real conditions of existence. It seems complicated, isn't it? But let me deconstruct it a bit. What Althusser claims is that ideology itself is imaginary. That reality itself is imaginary. What we tend to think of as reality, as our lived experience, is itself imaginary, is itself at one remove from our real conditions of existence. So ideology is just a representation of what is an already imaginary real. So it's very important to keep in mind the idea that ideology is not a presentation but a representation of ideology, of reality, which is already imaginary. The second characteristic of ideology is that it is embedded in material practices. And here, Louis Althusser diverges from classical Marxism, which tends to reduce ideology to ideas. Instead, Althusser puts emphasis on people's practices and lived relations, and argues that our ideas and actions are inserted, that is, are embedded in our practices which we perform on a daily basis. When an individual, he says, goes to the church and kneels in the church, he believes, and when he believes, he becomes a subject. Think of all other examples of our practices which we perform each day. For example, school, going to school, going shopping, etc. For example, take the school, and I forgot to mention this idea previously when we discussed the ideological state apparatuses. Louis Althusser argues that in the pre-capitalistic system, it was the dominant ideological state apparatus was the religious institution, was the church, but under the capitalistic system, the church comes to be replaced by the school, which becomes the dominant ideological apparatus. Now, when pupils and children go to school, they learn certain practices and certain ideas, certain skills and know-hows, which at the end of the day just prepare them for the job market, which is already framed and constrained and dominated and controlled by the capitalistic system. They learn the skill which will qualify them to work in a factory or to be technician in a factory or secretary in a firm, but still within the realm of the capitalistic system. So I repeat, ideology is embedded in the rituals, in the habits, in the customs, and in the practices which we do on a daily basis. Let's read this extract, which elucidates more the idea which I have just talked about. You go to school to learn a series of skills and become a person, eventually coming out the other end into the workforce. The knowledge that you are provided to be productive, to obey authority, to avoid criminality, you use for your own desires as a subject. But since your subject is created under the ruling ideology, your subject functions to preserve the ruling class. The ruling ideology, proving to be successful, continues so long as it is not challenged, and the ideology itself produces people that will not challenge it. The RSAs reproduces the same type of subject. So this is fairly the same idea I talked about before a while, that when you go to school and you study and you learn certain skills, you think that you are doing good, that you are doing yourself good, and you are building your career, but at the end of it, right, we are just cogs in the capitalistic machine. We are just preparing ourselves to take our position as in a predefined system. The fourth argument in this essay, there are 4 arguments, not 3. Well, so the fourth argument in this essay is the role of ideology in subject formation. Ideology, claims Althusser, transforms people from concrete individuals into subjects. The term individual here connotates independence, autonomy, and agency, while the word subject here connotates subordination, subjugation, and submission. So under ideology, we are never individuals, we are subjects. For example, when we were born into an established system. We were given names, we are assigned roles, we are taught certain values and ideas, we are disciplined into certain manners and ways of behaving and ways of relating to others. So we are always already subjects. We are never individuals under ideology or in the capitalistic system. To illustrate this idea, Louis Althusser gives the example of a person who is walking down the street, and he was hailed, that is called out by a police officer, "Hey, you!" And he says that at the moment when the person turns around to respond to the address of the police officer, he is interpellated. He is called into subject position, into an inferior position. Now think of other situations and instances in which we are called into subject positions, into inferior positions by someone or by the system. Think, for example, of this obvious but rampant idea of shopping. For example, at the moment that you see an advertisement and you decide to buy a product or a commodity because you are convinced or persuaded, convinced between inverted commas, of course, because you responded or reacted to the advertisement, then think of yourself as being interpolated, as being called into an inferior position, into a subject position. And you can generalize this idea, the idea of interpolation and of subject formation onto other examples and practices which we perform on a daily practice. So ideological practices which are taken for granted, which we perform daily, constitute the human subject and his or her identity, either through punishment, rewards, peer pressure, or through explicit violence. It constitutes the human subject and his or her identity within capitalism, thus allowing him or her to function properly and to be an effective producer within the system. Let me finish with two ideas which I forgot to include in this presentation. First is that ideology is unconscious. That is, we never come to actively and consciously choose our ideas and values. Ideology has a hypnotizing effect. It traps us into an unconscious believing and unconscious adopting of things without even being aware of them as the ideas and beliefs of the ruling or the dominant class and system. The second important idea is that ideology maintains a reciprocal relation with the economic and social system. Unlike Marx, who believes that the base mechanically determines the superstructure, for Althusser, the superstructure can itself can also influence and can maintain it maintains its independence, and thus can also influence the base and social and economic system. So it's two-way relationship. One influences the other. Although Louis Althusser maintains that the economic system eventually, or in the last instance, has a determinant and dominant effect on the superstructure. This brings me to the end of this presentation, but before we leave, I'd like you to think of Louis Althusser's conception of ideology and engage with it and evaluate it on your own, and address one of these questions. What's your evaluation of Althusser's concept of ideology, and what do you find most convincing or unconvincing in his in his concept of ideology? And can you think or bring some specific examples that illustrate more his ideas and concepts? And more importantly, can you compare and contrast Louis Althusser's conception of ideology with Gramsci's concept of hegemony? In what ways do these two concepts agree and differ? Thank you for your attention.